Hello, welcome to the Housing Sector Podcast. Today I have with me Dom, and Dom, we came into each other's orbit around Twitter, or X as it's now known. I still call it Twitter, and I've been really interested in some of the blogs that you've been posting and some of the information you've been sharing. Today, we're just going to start the conversation rolling by talking again about building safety. And I'm sorry if we keep going on about building safety. It seems like we're covering a lot at the moment. But we need to be honest. The government here is rushing to build 1.5 million homes, which we know is unfeasible. We've just lost Angela Rayner as housing secretary. This is the 10th of September. We've just lost Angela Rayner. Dom, from your point of view, what's going on?
Well, I think that the government, particularly when Michael Gove was housing minister, did quite a good job on communicating that they were going to protect leaseholders from remediation costs for fire safety, following Grenfell. Even to the extent where my dad was sending me news articles going, "Oh, this is good news."
Yeah.
But when you sort of look under the bonnet a bit more closely, um, a lot of what the government doing is performative, and really um, they've structured things in such a way that that is not really getting stuff fixed. Um, I think if we're looking specifically at the building, yeah, there is obviously is this contrast between wanting to build 1.5 million new homes and also making sure those ones are safe. And there's an industry is up in arms that the building safety regulator is not passing through enough planning approvals because that system is slow. And the building safety regulator actually the sort of recently retired director Philip White was in the House of Lords yesterday, talking about or sort of explaining their latest position, but kind of pushing back against some of these attacks that they're being slow in approving plans. That really it's industry is to blame as well. That they're having to demonstrate the functional requirements of the legislation up front within the plans, rather than submitting outline plans up front and then sort of adding to them and satisfying building control as they would have had to in the old days.
So,
Um,
look, we always panic when you hear there's going to be a film out and they've started filming, and yet they haven't got a finished screenplay. As a film buff, that always strikes a chord of fear. But hang on a minute, are we now building homes when we haven't got the regulations and the planning correctly sorted?
I mean, I'm looking at this from my perspective more retrospectively, in terms of there has been a poor system in place in the past, like lack of regulation, lack of control. The Grenfell inquiry shone a light on the fact that building control authorities often didn't really understand the legislation that they were meant to be enforcing. Um, I think forward looking, I think improvements probably have been made, although I've not been looking that closely, but there certainly does seem to be a big resistance from industry in terms of the building safety regulator making them explain like how their buildings are safe up front. And to me, that does present a risk if the post Grenfell recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry report are watered down, then that does give industry more chance to kind of wriggle out and game the system and not build compliantly. But overall, since Grenfell, there have been improvements on new buildings, albeit industry are complaining that the regulatory system isn't working, it's too slow. But Philip White yesterday was explaining that actually it is taking longer to approve these plans, because rather than processing them in accordance with their framework and just rejecting them, which they could do that relatively quickly, they're spending time going back to the applicants and explaining and sort of hand holding them a bit in terms of where they're not meeting the requirements. So whilst on paper industry can complain that the process is slow, in actual fact it's slow because the building safety regulator are trying to support the industry rather than just rejecting them outright and making them start that process over again. So um, it does, yeah, and you probably, given the poor regulation for probably for decades, you you would like to think that the government could hold their nerve a bit in terms of keeping the Grenfell Inquiry recommendations and forcing industry to adapt rather than at the first sign of trouble swaying to industry pressures and watering down the requirements. But that's what I'm concerned about, really. Um,
But that seems to be everything that, and we know when you're in the shadow government, you make these promises, and it's easy to make promises. It's easy to say how bad the other side is doing. When you're in power, that is a different conversation to have. And we've got, and let me just play devil's advocate for here. We've got Keir Starmer in. We've got, I think, issues with migrants coming over, which is going to cause trouble on the streets, and we're already seeing protests, people protesting outside hotels. We've got an education system, we've got a national health system, we've got all of these things that are on the floor. It seems like England is crumbling, and Keir Starmer just doesn't know where to start. Do we need to give him some more time to settle in?
one of my blog posts, recent ones, was talking about the kind of dilemma that Steve Reed, as the new housing secretary, has with the building the houses and safety. And it did compare. Steve Reed's kind of headline was, "Build, baby, build." That's what he's been saying to journalists this week, newly imposed. But the first phase of Starmer's government was fix the foundations, and I think sometimes people were criticizing that for being not visionary enough and perhaps a little bit dull. Um, but actually, it's not even a metaphor when when you're looking at building, is it?
Yeah.
Is actually, we do need to make sure things are built properly, because the other point that I'm concerned about is industry obviously have they have money behind them. They have the ear of government. Individuals who are in these properties that are affected don't have the same level of voice as industry. Industry can influence things to a much larger extent. So you end up in a situation, if you've got these national house builders, these big corporations who aren't following standards, who aren't being held to account, then you end up as someone who's been impacted by a building that hadn't met standards and the government not doing anything to hold them account. You end up losing trust in the whole system. Um, and I feel that this is, you know, where people are potentially, the center ground of politics is losing people, and people are going, far left, far right, because they don't trust in the status quo. And I think that's the big danger. And I think that ultimately developers are out there, their corporate interest, the corporate objective is to make a profit for their shareholders.
Yeah.
But should it be? Should their objective not to be to build safe houses, safe buildings to a proper standard?
What
Um,
when we've got organisations like the National Housing Federation, the Regulatory of Social Housing, all of these, bodies, where are they? They just seem to be sort of permitting it almost by validating it by staying silent.
yes, I think it's people don't want to put noses out of joint, and I think also I think the government itself feels that fixing these problems um, is too much of a problem to kind of change things. And again, it's like the more convenient option is to let individuals suffer for them to take the risk. But it's not the sort of just and fair option. I mean, if you think about people who play by the rules, they get a job, they earn money, they pay tax, they save for a deposit, they go to the bank and get a mortgage to buy a property that they believe was built to standard, and the government hadn't regulated that properly. The developers are out for profit and have gamed the system, have done things on the cheap, um, and cut corners. I mean, there's a whole raft of people I've spoken to who talk about kind of building control process where the developers will build a building, they'll do part of it properly. That's the bit that they show the inspector, and there's swathes of it that haven't been done properly. Um, and that is a kind of gaming of the system. And it's more convenient to let that happen than to hold those developers to account. And this is my biggest worry with the potential watering down of the building safety regulator. Some might argue that they didn't have enough powers to begin with, anyway. But it appears that industry has used the slowness of planning approvals to um, get that watered down further, rather than for the government to hold their own, really. And the other side of it that I'm interested in is actually, can the government force developers to build this 1.5 million houses? And really, the house building is driven by the economy, and most of the time it's driven by access to lending. That's one of the biggest correlation with house prices is the acceleration in borrowing. So if that contracts, then the house prices contract. If that accelerates, the house prices increase. So if the government doesn't solve the country's economic issues, and we do seem to be in a bit of an economic malaise, then how are they going to force the developers to build properly, or to release units at all? Because the values will come down, the developers won't be making the money that they think they should be making, and it will become uneconomical. And then you layer that over the fact that people stuck in these properties that are unsafe properties with huge service charges, large insurance, might be trapped there, might be unable to sell. It's causing them huge worries, huge anxiety, huge problems in terms of just not being able to move on with their lives. What impact is that having on the productivity of the country? And that's really what the Labour government should be focusing on. They shouldn't be focusing on having 1.5 million homes as their centerpiece. They should be focusing on, how do we do what's right for our citizens? How do we get them to be productive? And I do believe that it could be a big factor. And so whilst the government are listening to industry, and it just feels that doing the right thing and holding developers to account for not meeting standards is the less convenient option for them at the moment.
And of course, we're talking about the 1.5 million that they hope to build, but we've also got all the old stock, which we know isn't safe.
Yes, and I mean, and I guess that's the sort of secondary point about the building safety regulator, that all of the press attention is on the slow approvals for new buildings, but it doesn't really address the fixing the old ones. And this is really sort of where my experience and my focus has been, trying to pin down whether or not our building met building standards, whether or not these combustible materials should have been used at all. And there's evidence within the Grenfell inquiry report. There's a particular witness, Paul Savage of Wintec, where he actually talks about how use of combustible materials on high rise, how that wasn't really well understood by building control officials. So you'd have manufacturers would point them to part of the legislation, but they wouldn't be looking at it in the whole. And building control officials would sign off where there hadn't been full scale testing of the systems to be used on high rise. And that seems to be pretty widespread. Um, and the other point is that the government focuses on cladding, on just the external facade, but there's plenty of other regulatory breaches that aren't just about the cladding. In our case, we actually have um, wall panels that have combustible cores that weren't should never have been used on high rise at the time they were built, but also weren't installed correctly as well. But the developer is proposing to leave them in the building.
I
Um,
suppose it's impossible to get them out, isn't it?
Their panels, they could be taken out, but it would be more expensive. So it would be a more expensive fix. But the trouble that we've got is the remediation plan is kind of based on a review of a firm of fire engineers. So it's quite subjective. It's not they're just looking at how the building was built, but not always looking at actually how it was built. Sometimes just looking at plans with very little intrusive surveys. And in our case, they said, well, look, if this was installed as it was meant to be according to its BBA certification, then we think it could be okay. But they're not basing that on any evidence. So they're not basing that assumption that it should be safe on any evidence, and they're not actually checking that it was installed correctly. So it's wrong on both of those levels. Um, and the actual specific issue I had with our developer was when I've raised these concerns with them, and I've my point has been the government might not be requiring them to have met historic standards, but for us it's relevant because if you don't understand how it was built, and if you don't understand how it was meant to have met standards, how do you know what's what's wrong with it now? And it appears that the fire engineers are kind of conflating not having to confirm whether the building met standards at the time with assuming that it did. And that means that they're coming out with false assumptions. But when I actually raised these concerns with the developer, they said they'd look into it. A third party consultant, but they they didn't get them to look at the point that they said they would. They withheld the report from me, um, and it turns out that the consultant that they used didn't do any of their own work in terms of looking at it. They just read the report of the previous consultant and said, "Well, they're more experienced than we are in these matters, so we think it's probably okay." That's the kind of summary of it. But the worst thing was when I phoned up that consultant, and I phoned up in good faith. The developer had told me that they were going to get permission to share the document. He shared the document. I phoned the chap who wrote it up. I gave my name, um, and he sort of started talking about the report, explaining why he hadn't actually done any of his own work because he said it would become a very long report, and presumably that sort of budgetary constraints. And I said to him, but we have, but it's a high rise and there's the combustible materials we use. Surely that's not around. And he said, wow, I would never have used that material. So this expert that they've used actually didn't really agree that the material should have been used, but was happy to put in writing that it could remain on the building. And I think that's quite misleading. Um, and this is what, up and down the country, people are having to put up with, people manipulating opinions based on often lack of evidence, lack of testing data, lack of actual intrusive inspections. So yeah, I mean, this is why I've sort of kind of become keen on speaking out about it, really.
Throughout everything that you've been saying, the expression, and it'll probably end up being the title of the podcast, is smoke and mirrors. I'm just hearing, look the other way, it's all an illusion. Just to come back a little bit, Dom. So this is personally impacting you. You didn't choose. You're another one of my reluctant heroes. You didn't choose to get involved. This is impacting you and your home and your safety. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I don't live there anymore, so we actually moved out before we found out about it. But had the plan to sell it within the kind of 3 year stamp duty window. But then found out about all of this stuff in between. So it's kind of meant that it's impacted us from a financial perspective, but in some ways we're very lucky that we weren't stuck there through COVID, and so in some ways lucky, but also it kind of has impacted us. And I know other people who have been impacted much worse, like it's caused them kind of serious problems with anxiety and stress, and had quite a detrimental impact on their lives. So I feel that there's a lot of people who might not have the mental energy even to really, speak out about it. So I can almost feel obliged that whilst I am relatively lucky, I should.
Yeah, it's the same. And I said we're recording a few podcasts today, and the conversation I just had with Lee, I'm not sure if that will go out before or after you. He's in exactly the same boat. That well, someone's got to stand up for it, and the other people, Matt Lismore, Dan Bruce, Alex. I keep speaking to the same people, and they all had extremely productive lives, bringing value into our own economy and being, productive members of society. And all of that is kind of being sort of sidelined so they can focus on making sure homes are safe across the country.
Yeah, and it's an unfair battle because you've got these big national house builders with where people are getting paid to mess you around, whereas we're all having to do it around jobs, so for free. So it's a very unequal battle. I mean, this is the whole not holding the developers to account for not meeting standards. To me, is a point of justice, really. Where
Mm.
it's not equitable. There's no consumer protection. I know of Dan Bruce's situation, and I think that's much more extreme than my situation. Probably much more extreme than many people's situation. But again, there's a kind of gaming of the system that that's a whole nother topic, like warranty providers, and actually are they really worth anything? People buy new homes with the expectation that they've got this kind of 10-year warranty on our place. Our warranty was issued even before the building was signed off as completed. Work that one out. So,
Yeah.
so I think I don't want to sort of talk ill of all of the warranty providers. There must be some that at least do pay out sometimes, but I think that certainly are. I mean, you look at Dan Bruce's case, that just doesn't seem right at all. The defects are of such a magnitude that they've effectively gamed the system, used legal process to make it virtually impossible virtually impossible for most people. I mean, he must be in a tiny, tiny percentage of people who would be in a position to fund legal costs for that kind of thing. Um,
And you got Keir Starmer as his local MP,
yeah.
making all the promises before the election and then unable to deliver once in power. Um, Dom, so how much time do you think you spend personally? Let's try and bring this back to the human element. How much time do you think you're spending personally on these issues a week?
Um, is I think that most days I will spend some time on it if it's sort of chasing people up on emails because you think of all the different government departments sort of giving you the runaround.
Yeah.
You've got the local authority building control. You've got MHCLG and their various departments. You've got, trying to reach out to some of the um, kind of campaign groups who are difficult to get hold of and who don't, you kind of sometimes feel that some of the campaign groups aren't particularly um, vocal about the problems and almost it's like you have to kind of agree with government to get a seat at the table. So they seem relatively impotent and difficult to get hold of. Whether it's trying to contact journalists or the building safety regulator. I think most days I spend some time on it. Over the last couple of years, it it's got to it's got to add up to days of weeks and months of time. Um,
We go back to journalists there. I find there's peaks of interest where they're suddenly going, oh yeah, I was doing really well before the post office scandal. And then the post office scandal went and the lady I was talking to at the BBC, and we'd had multiple conversations, and she went, "Yeah, I'm really sorry, Ben. We've got to put this on the back burner while we all focus on the post office." And when the Grenfell documentary came out, I thought Grenfell was going to be, excuse the term, the lightning rod that brought the attention that was needed.
yeah,
Here we are 8 years later, no prosecutions. It isn't the documentary that came out, and I've spoken to the director producer of that. And it's gaining traction, but it doesn't seem to be having the same. impact that the post office scandal did, and yet we're still in the same sort of time span, if not longer. Does it need an ITV drama premiere? And do you think because it would be such a dry drama premiere that we're not getting the press interest, or do you think the press are just looking the other way?
I think that the difference that you've got with something like the post office scandal is you've got the number of people impacted is far fewer, but it's they're impacted in more or less or almost exactly the same way. I think when you look at the building safety stuff, firstly, I think the government they've done pretty well on sterilizing the campaign groups into kind of um, accepting you know, a lower position than or more towards it's more towards the government's position, which means that then automatically you're not the campaign groups are already not going to be able to negotiate something that gets close to what we need to be done. I think that's one of the issues. It needs a total like rethink, by it needs them to be considering like all the kind of productivity issues, and that is something that the government is sort of treated as almost, we don't know why the productivity is so low. But when people don't feel safe in their homes, when they're trapped, when they're not they've worked hard to save deposits and put that in, and that's all wiped out. They paid tax on that money,
Yeah.
really. And I'm an accountant by trade, but if you look at it, if people lose money on houses that weren't built to standard, you don't get any tax relief on that unless you make a capital gain on something. But I've paid income tax on all of that money. I don't, it's just, even that part of it is not fair. And I've lost out on the stamp duty. I have a extra property I don't really want. I was hoping to get the extra stamp duty back. It's just, so there is that kind of, even the system is not whether or not the properties get fixed to standard is one thing, but how you're treating people and their losses is something that they could maybe address. If they said, well, look, it's impractical to fix everything to standard, you could start to have a discussion, but it's a lot of kind of blindsiding and stonewalling and government. I went to a MHCLG residents engagement meeting. It's about, how do we speed up remediation? They call it the remediation acceleration program. And it's the remediation acceleration program too, because they've tried it before. There, but it's all the talk is about speeding it up. And my point of view is we don't want it sped up. We want it done properly because the speeding up is what's causing the problems. You look at the Olympic Village, they had all of their cladding taken off. They had their remediation done. And I forget if it's I think it might be the freeholder. I think it is the freeholder, but um, they've had to provision 400 million to fix all of the compartmentation issues. Um, Someone at that very meeting spoke about how quite proudly about how they'd managed to get a fire engineer to take out all the combustibles. They got their building up to an A1, the top rating, so which would keep the insurance low. But somehow, coincidentally, it appeared he was proud of what had been done there, but then saying, well, actually, now we've got other problems cropping up to do with compartmentation that they're having to pay for. Not really twigging that this is a deliberate ploy by the government to keep liability away from developers. Almost like, well, they've done such a good job on that, but you need to look at the whole picture. You can't just say, okay, well, we'll do cladding, we'll narrow the scope. Like we'll narrow the scope so far. We'll do the scope without any proper intrusive survey. We'll start the work. We'll do that. The other thing that's happening is people are getting stuck in the building. Well, one of the people that spoke there been stuck in the building for 2.5 years. Like these projects are probably meant to take less than a year, but it already been 2.5 years with another year to go because they keep finding problems. And every time someone else spoke about every time they find a problem, the process for the government signing off the new works just takes forever. So they're actually treating people very, very badly. So it's not just about whether we fix everything to standard, it's also the whole approach is just causing more problems than it's solving in terms of kind of punishing people. But
Dom,
uh,
It's another alarming conversation we've had, but these are the conversations we need to be had. We've got all these conferences going on and they're not having the conversations that need to be heard. So thank you very much indeed for coming on to this podcast to talk about the issues today. I don't mind working hard. I don't mind paying my taxes and my duty. I just expect to be supported when things don't go right, and the problem is we're not. Dom, thank you very much indeed. It's been nice talking to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.